Hey everybody, welcome back to Behind the Veil, where we pull back the curtain on the LDS Church and expose things that they won't teach you in Sunday school.
Before we get started, I want to briefly introduce you to our faith transition coaching program. Untangling yourself from Mormonism or any high demand religion can feel isolating and overwhelming. But I'm here to help you navigate this journey with compassion, support, and the tools you'll need to move forward with confidence. There's no agenda. This is your path. Whether you find peace in Christianity, Buddhism, atheism, or something entirely your own, I'll guide you in discovering what resonates with you. You don't have to go through this alone, especially if you have lost a lot of support from family or friends. We also have group programs starting soon where you can begin to have a sense of community there. So click the link in the description for more information.
Awesome. And so now let's dive into today's episode. So first, I want you to imagine stepping into a room and that's kept completely secret from the outside world and swearing an oath before God, vowing to avenge the blood of a murdered prophet against the United States of America. And this isn't fiction. It was Mormon doctrine, and every patron in the LDS Temple endowment ceremony had to swear this oath of vengeance against the US government as part of their covenants before God. The LDS Church often presents itself as patriotic and law abiding, but for decades it held ceremonies requiring members to swear retaliation against the US government and vowing to allow their throat to be cut ear to ear and bowels cut out if they revealed anything from the temple ceremonies. And this oath of vengeance is just the beginning of this tale of being basically swearing to retaliate until the third or fourth generation. The oath of vengeance, which was a temple commitment essentially to blood retaliation against the U.S., and it led to a government investigation and a revelation of a shocking illegal activity among the Mormons. The Reed Smoot Hearings acted as an important moment when America realized that Mormonism was still neck deep in polygamy and political deception. The LDS Church had a history of defying the laws of the United States, to the point where the president at the time had to replace Brigham Young as governor of Utah and to establish law and order in the Utah Territory. You can learn more about the reign of terror under Brigham Young in our video on the Day Knights, as well as the Utah War. So, let's get started. So, following Joseph Smith's murder in 1844, Brigham Young added the oath of vengeance to the temple endowment ceremony, and all patrons in the Nauvoo temple were required to take this oath of vengeance. So here is the exact wording of that oath. You and each of you do covenant and promise that you will pray and never cease to pray to Almighty God to avenge the blood of the prophets upon this nation, and that you will teach the same to your children and to your children's children unto the third and fourth generation. And this oath was part of a broader topic of doctrine preached over the pulpits by Brigham Young, known as blood atonement, which we've also done a whole video on, and I highly recommend you guys go check it out. But we got John D. Lee articulated this pervasive nature of this doctrine in his confession of his involvement in the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Lee stated, I believe then, as I do now, that it was the will of every true Mormon in Utah at that time that the enemies of the church should be killed as fast as possible, and that as this lot of people had men amongst them that were supposed to have helped kill the prophets in Carthage jail. The killing of all of them would be keeping our oaths and avenging the blood of the prophets. This is
I
very
don't,
clear that, like, hey, if you are an enemy of the church, you should die, basically.
yeah, I don't think people realize how all encompassing this blood atonement kind of violent rhetoric actually was. So, after the events of the massacre became known to the United States government, Lee was the only man out of dozens of participants who was executed by Utah's territorial government. In keeping with Mormon beliefs about blood atonement, Lee was executed by firing squad. Until 2004, Utah's capital punishment laws allowed the condemned to choose execution by firing squad. Swearing revenge against the U.S. government was while simultaneously seeking statehood was bordering on treason and led to animosity toward U.S. citizens crossing through Utah on their way to California, as well as the most gruesome massacre known in the West, which we talked about earlier, which was the Mountain Meadows Massacre. The hypocrisy of the LDS Church claiming to be patriotic and trying to become a state, while literally indoctrinating members to hate the government and citizens of the United States, is ridiculous and beyond reason. There were a lot of concerns in the United States about the Mormon Church because of their belief system, and it went beyond just their religion and their belief in God or how they believed about God. Critics argued that such oaths demonstrated a theocratic influence over members, potentially conflicting with U.S. laws. Historian Kathleen Flake noted, quote, the 4-year Senate proceeding created a 3,500-page record of testimony by 100 witnesses on every peculiarity of Mormonism, especially its polygamous family structure, ritual worship practices, secret oaths, open canon, economic communalism, and theocratic politics. So let's set up the conditions leading up to the Reed Smoot case. This isn't just about 1904 and what was happening then. The LDS Church was already in deep water with the United States government because of their illegal and abusive practice of polygamy. The LDS Church tried to whitewash this issue on their official website. But the U.S. government had had enough of their trafficking women from foreign countries, forcing them into polygamous marriages with no way to flee from the territory, along with blood atonement doctrine. And there was a lot of violence in the territory, as we've talked about, detailed by Judge John Cradlebaugh in a lot of our previous videos. The LDS Church tries to play victim in this scenario in their article. They have an article called Our Heritage, A Brief History of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a period of trials and testing. Of course, they love their trials and testing and persecution. So in this article, they talk about the events leading up to the 1890 manifesto, and they always claim that this declared an end to polygamy. But if you read this manifesto, it says no such thing. It's not saying they're going to end it. It says, we're not teaching it. We're not practicing it. We don't know what you're talking about. So it's kind of interesting that they say that this ended something that it never said it did. But anyway, moving on. They didn't even stop after the 1890 manifesto. And we're going to be talking about that in the following weeks. They were lying to the government, essentially, and they did it repeatedly. In this article, they described the actions the United States government began taking against the territory to curtail their abusive and violent practices towards women that were illegal, but they play the victim. Now, oh, polygamous men were being jailed and families were being torn apart. Well, yeah, they were, because you were doing things that were illegal and abusive, obviously. But that's kind of how the LDS Church still paints this. In the late 1880s, the U.S. government passed laws to try to stop this practice. And it was in 1882, it was the Edmunds Act, and it was passed in an effort to curtail this abusive practice of polygamy. And we will detail in later videos as well how there was incest going on, marrying of relatives, marrying of underage girls. This was not just a Joseph Smith thing. This was happening ad nauseum all over the place. The law stated that anyone practicing polygamy would not be allowed to vote or serve on a jury. Anyone practicing polygamy would not be able to serve in public office. This is where we're getting Reed Smoot's issue. And they also restricted the amount of property the church would be allowed to own if they continued to do so.
The church tells a story that on the evening of September 23rd, 1890, the prophet, acting under inspiration, wrote the manifesto, which was a document that ended plural marriage for church members. So on September 24th, 1890, the First Presidency and Quorum of the 12 Apostles sustained the manifesto, and the Saints approved it in the October 1890 General Conference. So today this document is included in the Doctrine and Covenants as Official Declaration Number 1. It says, following the church's actions, federal officials issue pardons to Latter-day Saint men convicted of violating the anti-polygamy laws, and much of the persecution stopped. But as President Woodruff explained, I should have let all the temples go out of our hands. I should have gone to prison myself and let every other man go there. Had not the God of heaven commanded me to do what I did do, and when the hour came that I was commanded to do that, it was all clear to me. I went before the Lord, and I wrote what the Lord told me to write. So the polygamy in Mormon doctrine is well portrayed in this comment, and that he would rather go to prison and let every other man go to prison rather than stop this abusive practice. And if you don't believe that polygamy in early Mormonism was abusive, let's provide a little evidence before we move on. So here we have a quote from Orson Hyde. He said, I find a great spirit in men for getting more wives. And I have heard that in this place there is not a girl knee-high to a toad that is not engaged. They're literally marrying women left and right. But
And 12-year-olds, like when he's talking, there's not a girl knee-high to a toad. He's talking about underage girls.
Mm-hmm.
And some of these, a lot of people don't realize some of these apostles were marrying girls as young as 12, but many of them were 15, 16 years old.
Yeah, it was crazy. And the massive age gaps, these little girls getting married, it's awful. And it doesn't end there. We've also got a quote from Heber C. Kimball, which was published in the New York Times, basically exposing the trafficking of women. Some time ago, Heber Kimball was lecturing some missionaries who were preparing to start out on foreign missions in the tabernacle, and said to them, Brethren, I want you to understand that it is not to be as it has been heretofore. The brother missionaries have been in the habit of picking out the prettiest women for themselves before they get here, and bringing on the ugly ones for us. Hereafter, you have to bring them all here before taking any of them, and let us all have a fair shake. Basically, here Heber C. Kimball's like, guys, don't marry them out there. Don't marry them out there. Bring them here. I want first pick, essentially.
Yeah, and they're like, we've talked about this trafficking issue because it was a huge issue, and there are many newspapers in the foreign countries that were trying to warn women, don't go there. It's not the land of milk and honey and all this stuff that they tell you. They're lying to you. So we have detailed that in previous videos as well. But this just gives you an idea of why the U.S. government was trying to stop this. This was not innocent. This was not about religion even. This statement tells you this man is being extremely disrespectful. And basically, you can tell it was just all of their selfish, disgusting perversion is why they're doing this. So let's look at the Irish newspaper. This is the Freeman's Journal, Wednesday, September 6th, 1843, and this is on page 2. And in Ireland, they are trying to warn the women not to listen to the missionaries and not to go to Utah with them. And actually, they're warning the men as well. And this is what they say in that newspaper. They say they want either young women that they may ruin them, or young men to be their slaves. The males from 18 to 45 years of age are all required to bear arms. The writer describes this place as, so when he's talking about the writer, they were sending journalists out to kind of see what was really going on there. So he says the writer describes this place as miserable. The condition of the settlers are wretched, and the conduct of the prophet and his minions as abominable and blasphemous in the extreme. Again, we say, be not duped by these impostors. How much more clear can we be that a lot of newspapers around the world were trying to warn people not to come to Utah because of the conditions that people were living in and the way that women were treated? So when they say that it was religious persecution, it was not. We have in-depth information about the trafficking of women in our episode that was called Exploited by Faith. So if you're interested in that, go check that one out. The church tries to play the victim persecution card all the time. It's just what they do. It's what they still do. But the reality is far darker. The US government was not interested in their personal affairs as it was interested in their violent and abusive tactics and belief systems, blood atonement, violent rhetoric against Gentiles or outsiders, violent rhetoric against the government or apostates, the treatment of government officials that were stationed in Utah. We talked about this in our previous video. It was a dumpster fire in Utah, and the US government was trying to get a handle on this violent part of the Wild West. The LDS Church doesn't want you to know that part of the story. So back to Wilford Woodruff and his fake 1890 manifesto claiming that they were not practicing plural marriage or teaching it. So I want to read this 1890 manifesto to you word for word. And the reason that I want to do this is not long, but the reason that I want to do this is because I want you to see that this has absolutely nothing to do with ending polygamy. It never says that. So here it is. It was on October 6, 1890, and it says, "To whom it may concern. Press dispatches have been sent for political purposes from Salt Lake City, which have been widely published, to the effect that the Utah Commission, in their recent report to the Secretary of the Interior, alleged that plural marriage are still being solemnized and that 40 or more such marriages have been contracted in Utah since last June or during the past year. Also, in that public discourses, the leaders of the church have taught, encouraged, and urged the continuance of the practice of polygamy." So far, they actually are doing those things. But he's trying to say, no, we're being accused of doing this. Then he goes on. "I, therefore, as president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, do hereby, in the most solemn manner, declare that these charges are false. We are not teaching polygamy or plural marriage, nor permitting any person to enter into its practice. And I deny that either 40 or any other number of plural marriages have during that period been solemnized in our temples or any other place in the territory." So here's the thing. He's not saying, okay, we're going to end it. It does not ever say that. It says, you guys are lying. We're not doing this. The problem is Wilford Woodruff himself, his son, and many other church leaders married polygamous wives after he said this. So he was full out lying that they were not still doing this. But this didn't end anything.
Yeah, absolutely not. And it says one case has been reported in which the parties allege that the marriage was performed in the endowment house in Salt Lake City in the spring of 1889. But I've not been able to learn who performed the ceremony. And whatever was done in this manner was without my knowledge. In consequence of this alleged occurrence, the endowment house was, by my instructions, taken down without delay. Inasmuch as the laws have been enacted by Congress forbidding plural marriages, which laws have been pronounced constitutional by the court of last resort, I hereby declare my intention to submit to those laws and to use my influence with the members of the church over which I preside to have them do likewise. In my teachings, there was no church or in those of my associate during the time specified which can be reasonably constructed to inculcate or encourage polygamy. And when any elder of the church has used language which appeared to convey any such teaching, he has been promptly reproved. And I now publicly decree that my advice to the Latter-day Saints is to refrain from contracting any marriage forbidden by the law of the land. So again, this is by Wilford Woodruff. So was Wilford Woodruff telling the truth here? So were they no longer teaching or practicing polygamy by the time he wrote this 1890 manifesto? So President Woodruff himself married a new plural wife in 1897, 7 years after they supposedly ended polygamy. Her name was Lydia Mountford, and in order to conceal the marriage and prevent it from being recorded, he married her in, again, September of 1897 on a steamship in the Pacific Ocean between San Francisco and Portland. And he had arranged for an apostle to perform plural marriages on steamships, so they continued their practice of polygamy, and it would not be recorded, and therefore it would have been concealed from the government. And LDS historian D. Michael Quinn detailed in his 1891 lecture in Bluffdale many
1991.
I'm so sorry. Thank you so much. 1991, that many polygamous marriages among LDS prophets and apostles, as well as authorized polygamous marriages among the general membership of the church. And we don't have enough time to detail all this today because, of course, we want to get into the Reed Smoot case, but we will detail this in future episodes. But the main point we want to make here is Wilford Woodruff lied in his address to the manifesto to the U.S. government. And Heber J. Grant entered into a plural marriage in 1901, over a decade after that 1890 manifesto. And this act indicates that some church leaders continued to practice polygamy despite its official secession. So, did they stop preaching about polygamy after this manifesto?
They really didn't stop anything. They were just lying to the government, is basically all that it was. So in 1897, Joseph Smith wrote, "The doctrine is not repealed. The truth is not annulled. The law is right and just now as ever, but the observance of it is stopped." So that was kind of his take on it. We're going to learn a little bit more about Joseph F. Smith and what he did. But the Salt Lake Tribune published a damning article November 1st, 1910, showing that polygamy was practiced well beyond the 1890 manifesto. And they wrote, "There has been a steady and persistent recrudescence of polygamy that has been not at all distasteful to the Mormon chiefs. So far as we are able to calculate, and without ability to prove the assertion except circumstantially, there have been approximately 2,000 polygamous marriages since the manifesto forbidding them was issued and adopted in 1890. Most of these, as indicated by our recitals in over 200 cases, whose details we have exposed, have occurred previous to the year 1904. As illustrative of our meaning, we will say that Walter C. Lyman, president of the San Juan Stake of Zion, and brother to Francis M. Lyman, has married Lucy Halls, a daughter of his first counselor, which is something they did all the time, William Halls, in polygamy since the manifesto, but slightly prior to 1904. Elder Ben E. Rich, who still retains his position as president of the Eastern States Mission of the Mormon Church, has taken 2 unlawful wives within that period. Frank Y. Taylor, president of the Granite Stake, has taken 1 in what the hierarchs have determined to call, quote, the open season. Elders George M. Cannon, Joseph M. Tanner, Henry S. Tanner, and others have practiced polygamous marriage within the seasons bounded by October 6, 1890 and April 6, 1904. Now, 1904 is the important date. Why they're talking about this is the Reed Smoot case then is starting in 1904 because of all of what has been going on, and they're accusing Reed Smoot of also being a polygamist. So he says, and in one case later, it is even said that Joseph F. Smith has taken on, so he later became a prophet. He took 2 polygamous wives during that time, and Francis M. Lyman has added 1 to his household. So it's very, very clear that the LDS Church was flat out lying to the United States government about their illegal polygamy practice. This sets the stage for the Reed Smoot case because it is part of the issue the government had against LDS leadership participating in the government office because they were supporting illegal activity. In fact, Reed Smoot was accused of being a practicing polygamist as an elected senator, despite the Edmunds Act prohibiting such a person from being in political office. Now, I want to say Family Search has scrubbed a lot of information about him, so it's very difficult to find that information, but we're going to try to at least show to you what the accusations were so that you can kind of decide what you think. Because as we're looking through all the documents, we're finding that all of the church leaders were practicing polygamists, and yet they're trying to say that Reed Smoot wasn't, which is quite suspicious if you ask me. So let's look at who Reed Smoot was. He was a high-ranking Mormon apostle elected as a U.S. senator in 1903. His election sparked a lot of controversy. Could a Mormon leader serve in public office while still obeying the directives of a theocratic church? So let's look at the details of Reed Smoot's hearing as a U.S. Senator. So on February 23rd, 1903, the credentials for Reed Smoot, who was a Republican in Utah, were presented and placed on file. On the same day, a memorial from several Salt Lake City residents asked that Smoot, a well-known and influential Mormon manufacturer and banker, not be permitted to take his seat. The protesters were a small group of businessmen and Protestant ministers who opposed Mormon economic policies in Utah.
And despite the concerns of these ministers and businessmen, on March 5th, 1903, Reed Smoot took his oath of office under the Senate's policy that a senator whose credentials were in order would be seated and any challenges dealt with afterward. The arrival of the Mormon senator, a member of the church's powerful quorum of the 12 apostles, attracted national attention and unleashed a torrent of complaints against him. Petitions with thousands of signatures flooded the Senate from Protestant churches, women's organizations outraged by polygamy, and others influenced by newspaper attacks on Smoot. The protesters charged that the Mormon leadership, including the Quorum of the 12, held supreme authority over both spiritual and temporal matters for its members and frequently interfered in Utah politics. They also complained that leaders continued to believe in and encourage and practice polygamy even though it was illegal. The deluge of petitions, complaints, concerns, and resolutions moved forward in the Senate on January 27, 1904, to order an investigation into the hierarchy of the Mormon Church, which a central issue was whether Smoot, as one of the Quorum of the 12, had taken a church oath that made him ineligible to sit on the United States Senate. The Oath of Vengeance, which was a required part of the LDS Temple endowments, was of utmost concern. The Senate referred to the matter as the Committee on Privileges and Elections. The committee plunged into an investigation that lasted more than 2 years, gathering testimony that filled 5 volumes. And the scope of the investigation expanded far beyond simply Reed Smoot and became a full dissection of the structure and inner workings of the Mormon Church, as well as the temporal and religious concerns of the Mormons. Arguments against Smoot centered around 3 main points. First, he was a member of the church that encouraged polygamy. 2, he had taken a religious oath that disqualified him from the Senate. And finally, he was a member of a religion that united church and state. And these are legitimate concerns, especially when one fully understands how the church implemented polygamy and the suffering of women forced into its ranks under the guise of eternal damnation of their souls if they did not submit. The Smoot forces argued that since 1890, the Mormon Church had not controlled or attempted to control the elections in Utah, and Smoot had never taken any oath, including an obligation of hostility to the United States, as had been alleged. And as we know today, the assertion that Reed Smoot had not taken an oath of hostility towards the United States is undeniably false. As you read in the beginning of the podcast, we read the exact script in the Temple Endowment ceremony. And again, the church is being caught in a full-out lie against the United States government.
And this is actually interesting that this played out in the Reed Smoot case, because when we see Elder Holland in the BBC interview being asked if Mitt Romney had taken the death oath, saying he would slit his throat and cut out his bowels if he revealed anything from the temple, and saying we don't want someone in office that's supposed to like off themselves if they reveal anything that's of concern. And Elder Holland lies and says, no, he didn't. And it's the same thing here in the Reed Smoot case. They're like, no, he didn't do that. We know he did. Everybody that went through the temple during that time did that. But again, we've seen them lying with the 1890 manifesto. It's just continual lying to the government. It's insane. So the church also asserted, although none holding such high positions in the church had already been elected to and served in the U.S. Congress, More directly relevant to the matter at hand was the argument that none of the practices of the Mormon Church had any bearing on Smoot's constitutional qualifications to be a United States Senator. After hearing all of the arguments and reviewing the evidence, the committee on June 1st, 1906 voted 7-5 that Smoot was not entitled to his seat. So when we're talking about that deep of a dive into all of the Mormon Church inner workings, they initially vote that he was not entitled to his seat. On June 11th, a divided committee filed majority and minority reports. The majority recommended that Smoot be removed from office, having concluded that he perceived his first loyalty to be the maintenance of the corporate and spiritual interests of Utah's Mormons. For its part, the minority report contended that testimony before the committee failed to substantiate any of the charges against Smoot. The lengthy proceedings never included personal attacks on the senator, whose character they say was above reproach. The difficulty with proving that Reed Smoot had in fact taken this oath of vengeance is that LDS temple services are done with absolute secrecy. And at the time, all patrons were required to covenant before God that they would not reveal anything from the temple, or they would allow their life to be taken, as I stated before, by slitting their throat and cutting their bowels out. So how are you going to find out that he did this when there is no Mormon anywhere that is going to be willing to reveal any of this stuff because they've covenanted with God to off themselves if they do? This made it extremely difficult for them to prove that Smoot had in fact taken this oath of vengeance in the temple. When the Senate reconvened in September 1906 after its summer recess, the Smoot case took center stage. The Privileges and Elections Committee Chairman Julius C. Burroughs, who was a Republican of Michigan, led the attack against Smoot, tying him and the Mormon Church to support for polygamy, which we all know they 100% did. So we look at, this is from the official transcripts of the Reed Smoot case, and this is what they say. The election of said Reed Smoot to the Senate was in express violation of the pledges required by the Enabling Act and given in the state constitution and those made before and after by the officers and representatives of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as set forth in the protest of W.M. Padden and other citizens and electors of the state of Utah, which protest was filed in the United States Senate February 23, 1903, and is hereby adopted, and it is requested that it be considered as a part hereof. 13th, that the said Reed Smoot is a polygamist, and that since the admission of Utah into the Union of States, he, although then and there having a legal wife, married a plural wife in the state of Utah in violation of the laws and compacts herein before described, and since such plural or polygamous marriage, the said Reed Smoot has lived and cohabitated with both his legal wife and his plural wife in the state of Utah and elsewhere, as occasion offered, and that the only record of such a plural marriage is the secret record made and kept by the authorities of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which secret record is in the exclusive custody and control of the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 Apostles of the said church, of which the said Reed Smoot is one, and is beyond the control or power of the Protestants. So I just want to say here really quickly, this is the problem with these plural marriages. They weren't legal. So it's not like you're getting marriage licenses or anything like that where the government could track these things. It was all the records of these things were with the church. And how are you going to get those? It's only if the church agrees to release them.
Yeah. And the transcripts go on to say, your Protestants respectfully ask that the Senate of the United States or its appropriate committee compel the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, and that said Reed Smoot to produce such secret record for the consideration of the Senate. Your protectants say that they are advised by counsel that it is inexpedient at this time to give further particulars concerning such plural marriage, and its results or the place it was solemnized, or the maiden name of the plural wife. And we can see here, Reed Smoot is accused of being a polygamist, and they also claim that the record of this polygamous marriage has been kept secret in the possession of the first presidency and the quorum of the 12 apostles of the church. This is quite a statement, but thanks to historian D. Michael Quinn, we now know that this was in fact like what they were doing after the 1890 manifesto. And according to D. Michael Quinn's article in the Dialogue Journal, apostles John Taylor and Matthias Cowley continued authorizing polygamous marriages long after the 1890 manifesto. And this fact proves that the leaders of the LDS Church, including Reed Smoot, lied during this court case. The Salt Lake Herald editorialized that the Salt Lake Tribune pretends the declaration is a revelation, although no one today has heard anyone except the lying sheet say it was a revelation. Members of the LDS Church to this day are told that the 1890 manifesto was a revelation, and yet here you have Heber J. Grant claiming it's not. The majority of the U.S. Senate committee declaring in a bold heading in 1906, the manifesto is a deception. The manifesto was a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. Whew, strong words here. The manifesto was merely a tactical maneuver, according to historian Claus J. Hansen. So let's move on to, or continue with the transcript of this case. Wherefore, we ask, in the exercise of your constitutional power, to be the exclusive judges of the elections and qualifications of your members, you shall advise yourself of the substantive facts set forth in these protests by investigation or otherwise. And if the same be found substantially true, you refuse to accept the said Reed Smoot as a member of your body from the state of Utah, he not being possessed of the necessary qualifications. The oath of office required of and taken by the said Reed Smoot as an apostle of the said church is of such nature and character as that he thereby disqualified from taking the oath of office required of a United States senator.
Yeah, I think they had a lot of concerns, and they rightfully did, because the LDS Church was completely lying. The leadership of the church was lying. So let's look. We're going to go, still continuing with the Reed Smoot case. Army officers in the territory of Utah also gave reports. So they say territorial governors and commissions in their official communications, presidents in their messages to Congress, senators and representatives on the floor of Congress, political parties in their platforms have times without number through these years made public their suggestions, warnings, and reproofs against the dominating lawlessness of the leaders of this people. So we're talking about the leaders of the LDS Church, that all of these people, all of these government leaders have had to warn and reproof LDS leaders because of the lawlessness that was going on with what these Army officers say. At least twice, the character of the organization has been a subject of judicial inquiry, and testimony has been given and judgments rendered showing the treasonable nature of some of the oaths administered by it, which we know that to be true as well. All this and the experience of every resident of this state and of every impartial historian and writer on social science leads us to affirm with confidence that the leaders of this church, whom Senator-elect Reed Smoot is one, are solemnly banded together against the people of the United States in their endeavor to baffle the designs and frustrate the attempts of the government to eradicate polygamy and polygamous cohabitation, and especially to set at naught the law against the latter offense, which, as the Supreme Court of the United States has said, seeks to prevent a man from flaunting in the face of the world the ostentation and opportunities of a bigamous household. Very strong words against the LDS Church from these Army officers. They continue. No legislator can keep his oath of office inviolate if he or she allows the officials of an ecclesiastical organization to control his actions within the province of the state. The day must come in Utah when he who holds a higher allegiance to the chiefs of any alien or church organization than that which under his solemn oath belongs to the state must not be a lawmaker in the halls of the Senate. During this case, during the Reed Smoot hearings, the LDS Church president, Joseph F. Smith, was questioned about the continuation of polygamy after the 1890 manifesto. When asked about his own adherence to anti-polygamy laws, okay, I want you to understand this, so I'm going to emphasize this. This is the prophet of the LDS Church at the time being questioned during the Reed Smoot case. And they are asking him about his own adherence to these laws. And this is what he says. I have cohabited with my wives, not in a manner that I thought would be offensive to my neighbors, but I have acknowledged them. I have visited them. They have borne me 11 children since 1890, and I have done it, knowing the responsibility and knowing that I was amenable to the law. There you have it. The president of the LDS Church openly admitted that he was breaking the law and he was openly living in a way that defied the 1890 manifesto. He was not the only one to openly admit that he was defying the law. In other testimonies given in the Reed Smoot hearings, other church leaders, including Francis M. Lyman, Clara M. B. Kennedy, and Charles E. Merrill, admitted to continued cohabitation after the manifesto during the Reed Smoot case.
Of these four men exposed the reality that Wilford Woodruff openly lied in the 1890 manifesto when he stated, "We are not teaching polygamy or plural marriage, nor permitting any person to enter into its practice. I hereby submit to those laws and to use my influence with the members of the church over which I preside to have them do likewise." Clearly, they are not abiding by the laws, despite what is the supposed prophet writing in the manifesto. We're not doing polygamy, we're not teaching it, we're not doing nothing. But then we have four men openly admitting, like, oh yeah, we still did polygamy after this. Like, you can't have it both ways. Oh, we stopped polygamy. Oh, but we're still doing it. That doesn't work. And Reed Smoot acknowledged how devastating President Smith's testimony was to the public image of the church. He said, "The testimony of Joseph F. Smith has startled the nation," he wrote to a friend, "and the papers are having a great deal to say about the lack of faith on the part of the Mormon people with the government of the United States." F. Smith, in a sermon at Morgan, Utah, on Sunday, February 16, 1896, as reported by the church shorthand man and printed in the Deseret News, it says, "The man that shields the wrongdoer or that sympathizes with his wrongdoing is guilty of the wrongdoing himself. God does not look upon sin with any degree of allowance. The man that condones evil and protects him who is doing evil is guilty in the eyes of God as a man who commits the evil. I feel earnestly about this. My reputation is at stake. I stand as one of the watchmen upon the towers of Zion." And Reed Smoot sits with the 12 apostles of the church, full well knowing that they are living in open defiance of the U.S. laws and of the 1890 manifesto. And according to this sermon given in Morgan, Utah, this makes Reed Smoot guilty as those who are committing the crime. The Salt Lake Tribune goes on to say, "There is not a congressional leg for Smoot to stand on." And we have Apostle John Taylor, who had been authorized to perform secret polygamous marriages post 1890 manifesto, and he was subpoenaed to testify in the Reed Smoot case. The following statement exposes how Apostles Cowley and Taylor responded to their subpoena to testify. They say Apostles Matthias F. Cowley and John W. Taylor did not appear after being subpoenaed, and Taylor fled to Canada.
Of course he did, just like Joseph Smith used to do.
Exactly. All these church leaders love fleeing their responsibilities.
Yep.
And as we know, both of these men were authorized to perform secret polygamous marriages off the coast of California and in Mexico after the manifesto. And therefore, they didn't want to testify because it was either they lie and commit perjury or they tell the truth. They're like, hey, you know what? We lied. We were actually doing these marriages. And we found in an article in the Salt Lake Herald, February 27th, 1902, And in this article, the names and places of Reed Smoot's polygamous marriages were given. Dr. Lilac accused Reed Smoot of being a polygamist and then proceeded to provide as much evidence as he could for these marriages.
So we want to give you as much evidence as we can, but I also want you to understand, as I've gone through Family Search for many of our videos, a lot of information is scrubbed, and there's even annotations, notes put on by family members saying, my grandmother, great grandmother, whatever, keeps getting taken off as a wife because it looks bad because it was post manifesto or something or other. And they get really frustrated that Family Search keeps doing this. And so I want you to understand this is really hard to prove, but we want you to have this information that was published in the Salt Lake Herald and all of that, because we want to be as complete as we can. So this says, quote, one woman was Miss Greenwood of American Fork, and the other a Miss Jones of Provo. Mr. Smoot was married to Miss Greenwood in the Manti Temple. Mr. Smoot was married about 3 years ago to Miss Jones, the daughter of ex-Mayor Jones of Provo. So I want to tell you, this took a lot of digging to find out who the mayor of Provo was 3 years from the time this was published and find this woman. But yes, in fact, I was able to find her. It was claimed that these marriages were, quote, rumors, and that no evidence proved that they ever occurred. But like we said, they were going on steamships. They were going outside of Utah to do this, and they were not keeping public record. So it's really, I mean, these marriages were illegal and defied the church's 1890 manifesto. So all records were kept secret by the church. How did they decide that Reed Smoot was innocent? Well, let me tell you. Did they get proof whether or not he was a polygamist beyond testimony of those from his own church that denied it? No. There was absolutely no proof of innocence given at all. The senators who voted in favor of him simply said they were convinced by Reed Smoot himself. They just believed his testimony that he wasn't a polygamist, and that so therefore he was innocent. When in the history of justice in the United States has the testimony of the accused been just believed without any evidence? This is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard, but that was the only evidence that was used to say that he was innocent. When in the history of justice in the United States has the testimony of the accused been simply believed without evidence? We don't do that. We don't just say, hey, we've accused you of this crime. No, I'm sorry, I didn't do that crime. Okay, good. You're free to go. That never happens. And yet this is exactly what happened in the Reed Smoot case. And I just want to be very clear. I did a lot of research on this young woman who was the daughter of the mayor of Provo. And interestingly, it is stated that she was married to Reed Smoot's brother. But Reed Smoot also had another wife, but is listed as unknown. And so somehow in these records, it appears that they have been fudged. I don't know. We will let you guys decide, but there's something kind of amiss here. So moving on, the Salt Lake Herald reported on February 27th, 1903 on the statements of the legislators who deemed Reed Smoot innocent. And this is where in the Salt Lake Herald, they gave their reasons for doing so. They said, quote, in expressing disbelief in the polygamy accusation, several senators asserted the apostle had in the most solemn manner told them with the most earnest protestation that he was speaking the truth, that he had never practiced polygamy in any form, directly or indirectly, before or after statehood, and that on his solemn assurance, they had voted for him. So essentially, they just believed him. Senators Hoyt Sherman and George N. Lawrence, the two Republicans who voted against Smoot, declined to say anything. So here we go. Their reasons for voting in favor of Smoot had nothing to do with evidence. It's just his assertion of his own innocence. And he was convincing, he told them in a very solemn manner. This is not how you conduct any sort of legal proceeding. Just believe the accused because they say they're innocent, and they say it in a really convincing way. Good heavens, they all say they're innocent. Let's be real, you know? So continuing with statements by the senators, we have H.S. Larson, who was present when Apostle Smoot spoke to Senator Sherman, and he said, Mr. Smoot spoke in the most positive and convincing manner. He told Senator Sherman that he had no other wife than Mrs. Smoot, that he never had more than his one wife, and that Mrs. Smoot was the only woman he had ever known. But let's pause here. Do we know of any other LDS Church leader who openly lied about engaging in polygamy? Joseph Smith continually lied about it to the public, to church members, lied to his own wife about his illicit affairs. Every single one of them has lied in some way or another that 1890 manifesto was a lie.
So why on earth would we believe this man's denial of such a thing when we have caught LDS leaders lying red-handed over and over? Even the president of the church, Wilford Woodruff, entering into a polygamous marriage 9 years after his own 1890 manifesto. And we have more senators willing to blindly believe that Reed Smoot is innocent without any evidence. We have a Senator Love saying, I've heard Senator-elect Smoot say in the most solemn and positive manner that he was guiltless of any polygamous practice, and I believe him. So there you have it. No proof needed. We just have the accused swearing their innocence, and if they do so in a convincing manner, they're obviously innocent. Oh my gosh, this is crazy. And on February 20th, 1907, the ordeal of Reed Smoot finally reached a conclusion. After deciding to require a 2/3 vote to declare Smoot not entitled to his seat, the Senate first voted down a move to expel him, to 27 yeas to 43 nays, and then refused by a vote of 28 yeas to 42 nays to deny the Utah senator his right to remain in the Senate. And for decades, the LDS Church presented itself as a patriotic, God-fearing institution. But beneath the surface, its highest temple ceremonies harbored an oath that swore vengeance against the United States. The oath of vengeance wasn't just symbolic. It was a direct call for retaliation against the nation that the Mormons felt that they had been wronged. And this blood oath, administered in LDS temples, required members to pledge their unwavering commitment to avenging Joseph Smith's death, and indoctrinating generations into a theocratic ideology that put religious loyalty above allegiance to this country. But the oath of vengeance was only the beginning. Reed Smoot hearings in the early 20th century shattered the LDS Church's carefully curated public image. And what started as an investigation into a senator's fitness for office turned into a public spectacle uncovering years of deceit and political manipulation and secret continuation of polygamy that the LDS Church had long promised they had abandoned.
Yeah, the testimonies from the church leaders like President Joseph F. Smith exposed a tangled web of lies where polygamous marriages were still being performed in secret. Church leaders considered themselves above U.S. law, continued living with polygamous wives, and as Joseph F. Smith said, having 11 children with polygamous wives during this 10-year period or so. Temple ceremonies contained the treasonous oaths that directly opposed American values. The LDS Church stood accused of defying the U.S. government, breaking the very laws that granted them statehood, and lying to the public about their continued plural marriages. The Reed Smoot hearings should have been the moment the church was held accountable. Instead, the Senate allowed Smoot to remain in office, not because they proved he was innocent, but because they just chose to believe his testimony, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. This wasn't just about one man's Senate seat. It was about the unchecked power of a religious institution that had woven deception into the very fabric of its leadership. The LDS Church has spent over a century whitewashing its history, but the truth has a way of rising to the surface. The Oath of Vengeance, the Polygamous Underground, and the Reed Smoot Hearings exposed a religious institution operating in defiance of the laws it claimed to uphold. What does it say about a church that preaches obedience to God but lies to the very government that granted its survival?
This isn't just history, it's a pattern. Time and time again, the LDS Church has rewritten its past to suit its present. But we're here to remind you of what they want you to forget. The question is now, how much more have they buried? And how many more lies are waiting to be uncovered? And if you're questioning your own faith journey out of a high demand religion, know that you're not alone. Faith transition can be hard, and untangling yourself from years and years of conditioning can be overwhelming. But you don't have to do it alone. If you need guidance, click the link in the description for compassionate support tailored to your own path, no matter where it leads you. And this has been Behind the Veil. Stay curious, stay questioning, and as always, keep pulling back